Hello and welcome to this video on Australian media regulation. This is a bit of an overview as to what regulation in Australia looks like for VCE Media students. We're going to cover off the basics of what is regulation, why do we have regulation in Australia, as well as looking at the different types of regulation and then shining a light on one particular form of regulation in Australia, which is the Classification Board. So let's dive in and get started. Regulation, it's the term that refers to the control of the media by either the government or other bodies that are not the media producers themselves. Obviously, people who make media, whether that is filmmakers or somebody hosting a radio show or podcast, to even social media posters, they obviously decide that what goes in their media and who they send it out to. So regulation is when somebody who's not that person in charge of their own media, when they decide what goes in it or what can't be in it and who may or may not have access to it. These are the laws and policies that govern what we can see in the media and what we can't. It also covers things like media ownership, who's allowed to own the media and how much media is an individual allowed to own in a certain area, as well as the content, what's in the media, and then access, who can actually see certain types of media. So the first thing that we kind of need to understand when we're looking at regulation is, why do we have this thing, right? Why do we have rules about what can go in the media and who can see it? So we're going to look at the rationale for regulating. Now, rationale, that is just another term for reasons. So this is the reasons for regulating, or the reasoning for regulating the media in Australia. The VCE study design likes to use the word rationale. So you need to know that that's synonymous with reasoning, or these are just the reasons why we regulate in Australia. So here's a couple. Before we dive into some specific reasons, we need to acknowledge that there is an underlying understanding that whether you feel this or not, the media is generally considered to be a powerful force in society. Now, this power can be used for or against the greater good of a community. Now, like I said, you might not feel this yourself. You might feel fairly confident that you are mature enough to watch anything, that there's nothing that's going to gross you out. You would happily see an R-rated horror film and not be affected in any way. You can spot online scams from a mile away. You can spot misinformation and disinformation and fake news on social media. And you might be really confused as to how anybody can fall for scams and misinformation. But at the same time, you can probably think of somebody who would fall for that. And you might sort of sit back and think, okay, well, even though it might not affect me, or it might not affect some of my friends and family, I can acknowledge that there are other people who might be susceptible to the power of the media. And even if I currently am not, I'm kind of happy with the idea of somebody's watching out for the media to just make sure that they're not doing anything too insane, anything too offensive, anything that might infringe on my rights as a citizen. And this is why we have regulation, essentially. Regulation is the way of limiting the power of the media and protecting our citizens from its potential harm. Key to acknowledge that it's potential harm. We're not saying that the media is big and bad. We're not saying that if it was left to its own devices that it would cause harm and that would be its intention. No, we're just saying that there's the potential for it, so we better have some rules in place. Just like there's the potential for harm on our roads, so we better have some rules in place to make sure that we're limiting that potential danger as much as we can. So that's the underlying principle. Now we're going to look at two key reasons, key rationales stemming from that underlying belief. The first reason for regulating the media in Australia is to protect vulnerable audiences. Now, while the nature and extent of media influence, it's always going to be debated. For every example that we can point to where some poor sucker has fallen for misinformation in the media and has done something crazy because they believe what they saw on the television, for every example of that, we've got our own example of somebody who would watch the exact same program and be unscathed, uninfluenced whatsoever. So while this is always going to be debated as to whether the media has influence over people or not, many agree that it has the potential to have some sort of harmful influence over some members of our society. And when we're thinking about those members of society who may be susceptible to the influence of the media, this is who we label as a vulnerable audience. Right? They are vulnerable to that influence from the media. Typically, when we're defining a vulnerable audience, we can think of them as people who can't tell the difference between fiction and reality. They might scare easily by what they see in the media. They may lack emotional intelligence or that understanding of what's really happening in the media or the things that they see. And they may engage in copycat behaviour, see something and then try to attempt to do it themselves. So when we're labelling an audience as being those four things, what kind of demographic comes to mind for you? Yeah, it's children. Right? They tend to be the one who we first think of as being a vulnerable audience, where in this example, we can see some gun use and violence on the TV, and then we see this idea of copycat behaviour of these children playing and just acting out what they see in the media. Now, it should be noted that it's not only violence that we're thinking about when we're considering children. It's obviously exposure to other things that we would consider to be more mature content. So it might be nudity, it might be sex, it might be the use of adult concepts and themes like death, coarse language, etc. It's also important to acknowledge that children aren't the only vulnerable audience. Remember, we said people that might lack a certain understanding of the way that the media works. And so we might consider perhaps some elderly members of society could be susceptible, in particular, to things like online scams. We could think about people who might have a mental disability. So there's lots of different types of vulnerable audience. And we see media regulation come in to limit the influence that the media might potentially have over that group. Now, I should point out too that all groups could be considered a vulnerable audience. We're not just talking about kids and the elderly here. Recently, the Australian federal government is considering gambling ad bans, and the group that's most affected by that is adult men. So a member, a demographic in society who's typically not considered to be vulnerable. Even here, we can see that as far as regulation goes, anyone can be a vulnerable audience. Coming back to children, though, when we're thinking about, we've always thought about protecting children from the media. And in the past, in the broadcast era, we have thought about protecting these vulnerable audiences in relation to dangerous media content, right? Limiting their access to certain content. When the kids walk in the room, we'll switch this TV program off because it's not appropriate for them. When kids go to the movies, we're not going to sell them tickets to an R-rated film. So we've always thought about it in terms of content. However, more recently, regulation today also aims to protect those vulnerable audiences from abuse by other individuals. This is where we're talking about social media and interactions with some bad actors online is just as important and quite probably even more important to protect individual vulnerable audiences, especially children, as well as protecting their privacy from media institutions who collect private information. We don't like the idea of children being tracked online and being served advertising based on their behaviour. So we have some changes to some regulation around protecting vulnerable audiences, but at its heart, that reason still exists just as it did in the 1970s. The second rationale, or second reason that we've got for regulating the media is to uphold community standards. So while there's a general appreciation that informed, intelligent adults can make their own choice about what media they choose to engage with, there are some limits placed on the content that can be distributed to the public. There are some things that we as a society agree that nobody should see. And this is typically content that's extreme in nature and grossly contradicts our fundamental societal standards. So these are things that are absolutely not okay in any stretch of anyone's imagination. So a couple of things that we can consider here is material that promotes terrorism, graphic, real violence. So here we have the live streaming of the Christchurch massacre a few years ago. And obviously anything that involves child abuse is something that nobody, whether they are an intelligent, emotionally strong adult or not, nobody in our society should be exposed to that material. So those two reasons, protecting our vulnerable audiences who might be susceptible to media influence and upholding the common standards in our community, they're the two reasons that we're going to be deep diving into as far as our studies go. But you should know that they're not exclusive. These are not the only reasons for regulating the media. There's plenty of other reasons for regulation. One example is making sure that we have enough local media industry jobs in Australia and having certain rules about media companies here producing a quota or a certain amount of local Australian content. And so now that we've got the why do we regulate the media, we're going to look at a little bit of the how do we regulate. And regulation, it can be categorized into sort of three broad types of regulation. The first one that we're going to look at is government regulation. So this is a system of regulation by which the government establishes independent bodies and enforce laws and legal obligations on the media industry. Government regulation is really important because it does have law by its side, right? So there is legal repercussions if people don't follow the regulations set by the government. The example that we're going to look at as far as a government regulatory body is the Classification Board. Another type of regulation that we're not going to look at in so much detail is industry regulation. So this is a system of regulation by which a certain section of the media industry, they'll set their own voluntary rules and standards of practice. So this might be where all the TV networks come together and they write a rule book, they all agree to it, and they say, yep, okay, we're going to play by these rules. And so they can confidently operate their business knowing that this independent body will enforce the rules on them and keep them in check, but more importantly, will keep the other TV networks in check as well. So Fax or Free TV Australia is the television body, but we also have the Advertising Standards Bureau, who looks at all advertising in Australia and make sure that there is a consistent standard of practice, that advertisers aren't being misleading, that advertisers aren't causing offence in their ads. And so it means that that industry can benefit from having their own private regulatory body that looks after everyone else. It keeps the government out of it, which is good. It's good for the taxpayer that we don't have to pay that. And it's good for the industry themselves because they're the ones who set the rules themselves and agree to it, rather than having those rules set by the government. And then finally, the other type that we are going to look at in a little bit more detail is self-regulation. So this is a system of regulation by which an individual media organisation will set and administer its own codes of practice. Those individuals who choose to use that particular media service have to agree to the terms of that code. So we can think of all social media as having a self-regulatory code of practice. When we sign up for an account with TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, whatever, we are agreeing that we're going to play by the rules that they set. TikTok sets their community guidelines and they are the ones who enforce it. So if you post a video that includes something that TikTok doesn't allow, let's say nudity, then TikTok themselves will remove it. Okay, it's not. It doesn't necessarily fall under law. There are certain laws about what you post on social media. It gets a little bit confusing. But if TikTok decide to remove content that you've posted, it's not like you're going to get a fine or go to jail, like if somebody sold movie tickets to underage children to an R-rated film. Speaking of the regulation of film, we're going to look now at the Classification Board as an example of government regulation in Australia. So the Classification Board is the regulatory body that decides what classification, that's the proper term, decides on the classification, but we sort of more commonly refer to it as the rating to give every film, DVD and computer or video game that is released in Australia. It does regulate some literature, but for the most part, it certainly does every film or DVD and video game. Importantly, it doesn't regulate TV or video that appears on social media websites or apps. The reason why is because classification, they need to know what's in it before they can put that label on. So we need to know what's going to be in the movie, and then in teams, they will actually watch it and decide what classification to give it. They can't do that on live television because you don't know what's going to come next, and they can't do that on social media because there is just too much volume of material being posted on social media. The classification system works because it allows adults to make informed choices about the content that they choose to watch or let their kids watch. So myself, as a father of two young boys, I can see whether I let them watch a PG film or not and I will make that informed choice because maybe I think that there'll be scary scenes in it and I don't want them scared and not sleeping and climbing into my bed in the middle of the night complaining that they've got nightmares, right? So the classification helps adults to make some informed choices about what they choose to watch themselves and what they let their children watch. Now, some classifications remove that choice and restrict access to people over a certain age. Now, while it is an independent body, it runs itself, the classification board, it is empowered by law and it's overseen by the federal government. Ultimately, it answers to the highest media communication authority in Australia, ACMA, as well as the Federal Attorney General. Important when we're describing classification, it is not censorship. We cannot use that word to describe how the media is regulated in Australia. We do not have a censorship system. Censorship is a very specific word that describes removing certain shots, scenes, offensive images, or language. So that might be something like pixelating nudity on parts of the body. It might be bleeping out swear words. In Australia, we don't do that. In Australia, there is sort of the acknowledgement that the media producer, they are the person who are in charge of their own artwork. The classification board can say whether that particular piece of media content can be distributed or not, but ultimately it's up to the media producer themselves to decide, okay, well, maybe I'll remove that offensive scene or not. It's not up to our government to make that choice. So there are many countries that censor the media, and they're not just the ones that you would automatically think of. So even countries like New Zealand have some sort of censorship as part of their regulation system, but we don't have that in Australia. The classification board, it is made up of about 12 to 20 people. It can fluctuate who's on the board, and they do like to rotate through who appears on the board. The idea is that the classification board, because it is determining what Australian audiences can see, that they are essentially reflective of Australian values at the time. The problem with that, if you go to the classification board website, you can actually see who the board members are, and they don't necessarily reflect the broad, diverse demographics of Australian citizens. For one example, they all live in Sydney because that's where the classification board is. So even that limits perhaps their understanding of what people on the other side of the country find acceptable or not. They're mostly university educated, and typically in the past, although they are getting better at this, they tended to all be of similar cultural backgrounds. So that can pose a problem as to how effective the classification board is at reflecting all of Australia's values. How they go about classification is in teams of about 3. Members of the board will either watch a film or play a game or read each submission, and they will decide on the classification by majority vote. So you might have 2 members of a team decide that something should be rated M, and the other one decides that it should be rated MA, and ultimately those 2 individuals decide on the classification that is forever applied to that particular film. Now, when they are deciding on what classification to give, they're looking at 6 key elements. So 6 key categories or areas that they look into to see if there's any impact. The 6 elements that the classification board look at are coarse language, violence, drug use, adult themes, nudity, and sex. So if anything in any one of those categories is deemed to be of a particular level of impact, that's the classification that is allocated. And so when classifying films, the assessed impact or how severe or how significant that particular classifiable element, it will determine the classification category that the board allocates. So the classification categories are: if everything is deemed to have a very mild impact, G. We're probably quite familiar with these ones. I wonder if you can guess what the other ones are. But a mild impact results in PG, or parental guidance recommended. If the film or video game has moderate impact, then it's rated M. If there's strong impact, MA 15+. If there's high impact, rated R 18+. And then I wonder if you know what the sixth one is. We're probably quite familiar with these five, but we do in Australia have a separate classification category for high impact sexually explicit content. That's the X rating. Not often seen, but we do have that as part of a classification category. The ones on the left there, these are what we label as advisory categories. So this is advice. This is the informing consenting adults about what might be in that particular piece of media that they're going to engage with. So they're just advice. What that means is, by law, a 4-year-old could walk up to the counter at the ticket booth at Hoyt's, and they can say 1 ticket to see this M-rated film, and the usher might have a question as to where this 4-year-old's parents are, but ultimately there's nothing to stop that 4-year-old from buying that ticket to an M-rated film. The categories on the right, these are restricted categories. These are enforceable by law that restricts people of a certain age, and we obviously see those age limits on the right there. So that same 4-year-old definitely cannot buy a ticket to an MA 15+ film, and neither can a 14-year-old unless they have a parent accompanying them. A 17-year-old, even the day before their 18th birthday, cannot buy a ticket to an R-rated film, even if they do have a parent or adult guardian accompanying them. R-rated films are restricted to only people 18 years and over. There is a final category as well that the classification board uses, and that is the refused classification category. This is where a film or video game is deemed that it cannot be sold, hired, or advertised in Australia due to its extremely high impact. We would refer to these films as being banned, but the technical and the correct term is refused classification. The board says there is no category here that is suitable for this. It should not be seen by anyone in Australia, even if they are over 18. So an example of what sort of happens with classification, if we look at the Australian horror film Talk to Me that was released in 2023, it has been given an MA 15+ rating in Australia. So this restricts access to it to audiences 15 years and over, unless they are accompanied by a parent or guardian. The way that the classification board decided that is it looked at these 6 classifiable elements, and it decided that, well, there was actually no nudity, so that wasn't an assessed criteria. there was some mild impact of drug use and sex in the film. But then there was strong impact for the adult themes. Obviously, we're dealing with horror here. We're dealing with the paranormal. So there's some strong impacts in those themes. There is strong impact in violence as well as language. And so because even though it's got 3 of those things, if it had just one in this strong impact zone, that's what it deems it to be an MA 15 plus film. So you might like to go through this exercise yourself and have a think about your favorite film or a film that you saw recently. And hopefully it's one where you don't immediately know the actual classification. So maybe you don't have the DVD cover near you, or maybe you don't look at the corner when you're selecting it on Netflix. And I want you to have a think about this favorite film of yours and think about, well, what classification would it get? You know, is this an M-rated film? Does this have a moderate impact, or will I say that it's got some strong impact in it? So maybe it's M, maybe it's MA. And think about this against all of those 6 classifiable elements. You know, is there any drug references or use in there? No. Okay. Well, is there any adult themes in it? Oh yeah. Well, the main character's grandmother dies, and so I want you to think about how you would classify your favorite film, and then go to the classification board website, and you can actually look up all the films and see how they have classified it against all of those 6 ratings. All the films, they don't necessarily have that same level of detail, but certainly more recent films, they do tell audiences the exact impact that they have rated against all of those 6 classifiable elements. So that is a rundown of how the classification board works. We're going to look at some examples in the future of interesting case studies that have either challenged the classification board and its operation, or demonstrate some of the strengths of that board. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have learned something from this video.